Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and in today's video I want to do a top 5 list. I'm thinking in this video we do a top 5 class list, or actually better yet spec list of some of the specs that are so unique they are seldom played. If you're not a huge fan of the meta, and you're not really one of the people that likes to run with the sheep, playing all the popular meta specs, and you want to try something new, something fresh, something that's barely treaded, then this video will give you a couple ideas of where the specs are at for patch 8.2, the least played specs. To find out the specs that are the least played, we'll be taking a look at multiple different sources. We'll be taking a look at the popularity for the population of all the different classes and specs played, captured for PvE, as well as some of the logs. So take a look at the specs that are performing really well and which ones are not. And we'll try to pick out the specs that are the least abundant. Some specs are performing super well, but there's only a few entries, while others may be performing somewhat medium, but a lot of entries from a lot of players. So without further ado, let's take a look at the most unique specs in the game right now. At the very beginning of Battle for Azeroth, the expansion, a lot of classes felt terrible to play. The changes to GCD and losing our artifact weapon felt very jarring to a lot of us. But with patch 8.2, a lot of quality of life changes have happened, and the Essence system seems to have helped a lot of specs. Frost Death Knight is one of those specs. In the first raid of BFA Uldir, Frost actually had a very niche playstyle all about the Frost Breath, and then BOD came around and we haven't seen a Death Knight since. However, with the patch 8.2, the Essence system definitely shook up a lot of specs and a lot of classes. You have these new essences with active and passive effects. They can change and alter what a spec does. Lack in sustain, you can go for more sustain heavy essences. Lack in certain stats, you can have essences that make up haste, critical strike, and whatnot. Looking for more big cooldowns, you have an essence that will randomly on ability usages will pop your massive CDs, and that works with other Azeroth traits and can maybe even work with trinkets. So with all those different combos, it actually lets Frost Death Knight come out of its shell a little bit. Still, the Frost Breath playstyle is going to be something that a lot of people will utilize. It is true and tried in the Frost Death Knight formula. But now you can actually play other talents. There is a lot more option and so much potential for this spec. But coming off a feat of BOD, it's gonna take a while for a lot of people to get warmed up to what Death Knights are all about all over again. But a buddy of mine in the guild who does raid at a mythic level has been playing his Death Knight, and he actually went from maining his monk to now focusing more on the DK and really giving Frost Death Knight a serious try, particularly in Mythic Plus dungeons. And with all the Outlaws and Demon Hunters and Hunters all over the place, he can actually keep up fairly well. So if anything, from my personal experiences of playing Mythic Pluses, please know this: Frost Death Knights are looking a lot better in 8.2, and the future does seem a lot brighter in case you want to try one. The next spec on the list is gonna be Arms Warrior. Arms Warrior is only slightly less popular than Frost Death Knight in PvE. However, Arms Warriors have proven themselves more than enough in player versus player combat. Their playstyle of applying Mortal Strike, which is a healing reduction buff to enemies, the excellent ability to cleave through multiple targets at a time, and being able to basically one-shot enemies with all of their cooldowns applied creates a ferocious beast. But this spec has definitely been sitting on the benches when it comes to the raiding scene and PvE in general until this recent patch. If you play Arms Warriors right now and you haven't tried this, try the essence of Memory of Lucid Dreams. We've talked about this essence on the channel before, and it plays very interestingly with a lot of the resource generating abilities. And for Arms Warriors, you basically during your Colossus match with this essence can generate almost an unlimited amount of rage, which powers up other Azeroth traits in order to get you some of the biggest bursts and biggest damage than Arms have ever seen. And you would be happy to know that Arms Warriors, if you haven't tried it, have gotten a recent buff. A lot of the base abilities deal about 6% more damage, which is not a lot, but combined together with a 15% buff to their mastery, where most of your base abilities proc your extra bleed for mastery, it does combine for a pretty hefty buff. And with the changes to the Essence system, this spec definitely could shine in the right hands. I personally always like the idea of an arms warrior, and I still do need to level an arms warrior, at least on the US realms. I do have one on EU I can play around with from time to time, but I've always liked the idea of an arms warrior, an accurate, precise, deadly machine. I know a lot of people love Fury, and swinging axes and hammers and maces is always fun, but I've always found something appealing about the massive execute damage of an arms warrior. The next spec on this list is gonna have to be the Arcane Mage, and I'm surprised that this spec in particular hasn't got a crazy rework. Arcane Mages and other specs of mages, it definitely comes down to which spec is gonna be the best, and right now with Fire Mages taking over everybody's hearts, it is gonna be Arcane that ends up setting out as one of the lesser played specs of the class. I really do hope Blizzard in the future tries to make mage specs as close to each other as possible, because I think a lot of players would love the playability of Arcane and managing mana, Frost and managing icicles, or Fire and trying to just blow things up before you run out of cooldowns. But if you do want to play a more steady spec that actually doesn't look at cooldowns as much, instead you're looking at that mana bar and you do mana management as if you're a healer, then I think you will like the simplistic playstyle of an Arcane Mage. While the spec doesn't have too many crazy abilities, and honestly we should add more abilities to classes in future expansions, the Arcane Mage is all about managing your mana, and it is a very unique play style in terms of how you play. It's about managing a resource of arcane power and being able to blast unlimited amount of power as long as you have the mana to keep yourself going. The amount of mobility for Arcane Mages is incredible compared to the other specs, making them super good in PvP, where Arcane Mages are not really all about the burst playstyle of, let's say, Fire Mage, but rather they like to chip away at the enemies while kind of tricking around enemies and blinking all over the place and being relatively very hard to pin down. It's like the ultimate trickster class. It's like the ultimate master of arcane. The amount of power you feel in terms of control of where you are, what's happening around you, is kind of unique to what an Arcane Mage is. And I kind of like the idea behind it. Right now in PvE, they're not too terrible either. With the right gear setup, it could make for a very interesting playstyle. The next spec on the list is gonna have to be Survival Hunter. Now, I've always preferred the Survival Hunter, the unique playstyle of a melee hunter, which Blizzard tried to kind of bring back from vanilla-esque era into Legion, where in Legion was kind of give or take, and again it refreshed into BFA. I feel like they're eventually maybe gonna make the spec. Although, personally, I would have no problem if they were to make it a ranged spec again with the dot-based playstyle, but that's just me. But Survival still is one of the lesser played specs, primarily in PvE, where PvP it's actually quite the opposite. They're probably one of the more popular specs when it comes to player versus player combat, where I feel like that's where they were designed. Whoever designed Survival Hunters, I feel like does a lot of PvP, because in PvE and in raids and dungeons, they feel kind of awkward sometimes, but in player versus player, they're so smooth, and the whole mechanic of range damage and pet damage just feels so great when it comes to engaging other players. But how are Survival Hunters right now in PvE in 8.2? Again, the Essence system is going to help them out tremendously. Again, you are going to be taking a look at the Memory of Lucid Dream Essence. That Essence is absolutely nuts. You are able to spam a billion Mongoose bites with the almost unlimited amount of energy that you get from running Essence of the Lucid Dreams, which a lot of people can get fairly early on, which might give a lot more players an ability to check out Survival Hunter. And a couple of Survival Hunters, not too many but a few, have been able to take advantage of the spec in the last week of raiding this week so far, and try to push the spec to whole new limits. So if you want to play Survival or any of the other specs in this video, use this type of thing as encouragement. Even though the spec is the least played, or one of the least played specs, you can still do some really crazy and amazing things with it. And lastly, we're going to take a look at the spec that's probably the least played in all of PvE. And that's going to be Sub Rogue. Now, a lot of these specs in this video, you guys might think, oh, but this spec is so good in PvP, and Subtlety I feel like might be one of those specs that's super good in PvP. Against players, it's one of the top tier, but in dungeons and raids, they are barely around. I actually heard a lot about Subtlety rogues maybe being the potential meta with the right gear, with the right builds, so I've been kind of on the lookout for it. Apparently there's some sort of crazy builds out there, and maybe if I can figure out those builds, I'll cover them in a video for you guys to check out. But yeah, Subtlety rogue is just not that great of a spec in terms of popularity, at least right now. But take my opinion as that of a rogue main's opinion. I don't think Subtlety is completely down in the hole. I actually think there's potential for sub to come out on top and actually do fairly decent damage, whether maybe it's single target or pure AoE, has a very high potential. The spec has a very customizable talent tree, and a lot of the traits and a lot of the gear does work with one another, whether it's heavy mastery or heavy versatility or maybe heavy crit and even a little bit of haste. So there's every stat that you can utilize with various different builds, various different talents, so it's very customizable. I mean, the spec was in a great spot when they had Shuriken combo, which basically turned you AoE damage and the comp points it generated from it into very powerful focused single target output, which would have been amazing for this new affix of beguiling for Mythic Plus dungeons, especially if you have that ad next to a fairly big group of enemies. The spec still has some uses when it comes to focusing down enemies, and if you want to play a very bursty build, this would be great. We was hoping that the essence system would help out the spec more, and while it's not really the worst spec ever, it's just the worst spec of 3 specs of rogues that are available, at least for the PvE content. So, can you play Subtlety? Yes. Are you going to be top damage? Depending on the situation, but in most cases, you are probably not going to be at the top. We might just have to let the sleeping beast that is Subtlety live for yet another tier. Unless you guys feel a little bit masochistic, have fun trying to make your best Subtlety rogue build, which would be a reward in itself. And that's going to be my video for the top 5 least played specs in 8.2 as of right now for the PvE version of the game. Now, I hope all those specs get some sort of a buff. I mean, even Pharaohs and even Enhancement Shamans feel a little bit better than some of these guys. So hopefully they get some sort of a tuning in order to help them thrive, well, some of them at least, within PvE, as Survival Hunters looking like they're actually becoming pretty good. But I'm hoping that Blizzard takes a look at these specs at least one more time. Maybe give him some sort of buffs in order to make him more viable or at least somewhat competitive. It's never fun being at the bottom of the barrel. And right now that is Demonology Warlocks, which is sad because that's one of my more favorite played specs for Warlocks as of right now. But if you guys wanted to pick up a unique spec that barely anybody really gets to play that much, and maybe you want to be the guy or the girl trying to make the spec the best that it can be, well, here's your opportunity. Trust me, I like playing unique specs myself. Been an Outlaw rogue main since Legion through the thick as well as the thin, and right now the spec is probably at its top tier position compared to where it was in most of middle/end Legion, where Outlaw rogues just weren't really all that common. And it also helps to learn some of the lesser played specs in case they become overpowered, so you're the first person who actually knows how to play those specs once it is their time to shine in the spotlight. Which is in some sense kind of a unique thing that only you will be able to do if you learn any of these specs. But anyway guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do any of these specs appeal to you, or do you already have any of those specs as a class choice for 8.2? Whether you alt them or main them. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see all of you in another video.